Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Well, thanks for coming. We're involved in this One Town, One Book for the whole month. There's a lot of activities. If you get one of these back there, there's all kinds of stuff going on. If you want to come and talk about the book, we have 3 different book discussions you can sign up for. Professor Dorsey, she's kind of new to our area. She's only been here a couple years. She runs the Center for Revolutionary Era Studies over at Siena. She's part of the history department. In the past, she's been at Arizona State and, DeSales University. Most of her classes and courses she teaches are in early American and colonial history, and she's going to be our noon book review for our One Town, One Book, Mayflower by Nathaniel Philbrick. So here's Professor Dorsey.
Thank you. Hello, thank you very much for having me. I'm just going to reintroduce myself, if you don't mind, and then say a little bit about this program, and then I'll speak about the book. I have about 15 minutes worth of comments prepared. And then seeing as most of you have already read this, any one of you could stand up here and do this, it seems to me. So I am Jennifer Dorsey. I'm a professor of Early American History at Siena College. I'm also the director of the college's Center for Revolutionary Era Studies, if you haven't heard about that yet. One of my responsibilities as director is to develop educational partnerships between our faculty and our students and the extended community of public historians, local historians, and history enthusiasts in our region, in order that we can all work together to raise consciousness about early American history, and more specifically, the unique contributions of upstate New York to colonial America, the American Revolution, and the founding of the American Republic. So imagine my delight when Joe Nash, the librarian of the William K. Sanford Town Library, called me to tell me that the Colonie community is reading Nathaniel Philbrick's Mayflower, a story of courage, community, and war. Joe, thank you for choosing a history book for your One Town, One Book read.
It was either that or The Great Gatsby. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, it's been done. And having said that, I think you've kind of made my work as a director a little irrelevant, but congratulations to you, and thank you. And if you don't already know about all the great programming that the library has going on around the book, please find out. I think you said there were flyers in the back. And we just thank the library for doing this? I think it was the director's over there. So, hello, sir. Thank you very much. I imagine this was a lot of work for your staff, and I really appreciate it. So my job, as I understand it, is to introduce to you this author, this text, and to offer you some thoughts about it as a work of history. Now, about Philbrick, it seems like I imagine most of you know something about Philbrick. He is an amateur historian. He's a student of American literature. He studied at Brown and Duke. He graduated with a master's degree in American literature from Duke University and then worked for 4 years at Sailing World. He was also a freelance writer for a number of years, and during which time he wrote several books and edited several books, including something called Yachting, a Parody. He moved to Nantucket in 1986 and became interested in the history of the island. And he wrote subsequently something called Away Offshore, Nantucket Island and Its People. And at that point, he was offered the opportunity to start the Egan Maritime Institute in 1995. In 2000, he published In the Heart of the Sea, which won the National Book Award for nonfiction, followed by Sea of Glory in 2003, which won the Theodore and Franklin D. Roosevelt Naval History Prize, and the Albion Monroe Award from the National Maritime Historical Society. In 2006, he wrote Mayflower, which, as many of you know from the title, or from the cover, was a finalist for both the 2007 Pulitzer Prize in History and the Los Angeles Times Book Award, and was winner of the Massachusetts Book Award for nonfiction. Those are nice credentials. Yeah. Mayflower is an important book because it gives Americans a realistic picture of Plymouth and the neighboring Massachusetts Bay Colony. It tries to separate facts from the mythology of the Pilgrims. Much of it, that mythology, created not in the 17th century, but in the 19th century, hundreds of years away. Philbrick reminds us, for example, that even the term pilgrim was invented by early 19th century New Englanders. The actual pilgrims didn't call themselves pilgrims. They called themselves saints, and they called everybody else strangers. Similarly, the first Thanksgiving was not commemorated by Americans until the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln established that holiday as a celebration of nationhood, and only since then has the original Thanksgiving become the emblematic moment of 17th century American history. Philbrick's last chapter, if you haven't seen it yet, tells the story of how the 19th century descendants of the Pilgrims organized the Pilgrim Society and then enshrined the so-called Plymouth Rock in a temple-like structure at Plymouth Harbor so that we could all go and pay due homage to our ancestors. In other words, generations of Americans have learned about the Pilgrims, but we've all been using the Pilgrim story, or what we think we know about that story, not to understand history or the origins of America or colonization, but to reaffirm our understanding of ourselves contemporarily, whenever that is, the 19th century, the 20th century, and our values. And today, the Pilgrims are not real people. They're symbols of all that was good in America, or is good in America. We know about the Pilgrims what we want to know, not the actual experience of real-life Indians and the English in the 17th century. Philbrick, in his preface, says that he wrote Mayflower to recover the real history of these people and tell us, and he writes, the story we need to know, not the story we already know. Having said that, Mayflower, the title of the book, is a misnomer. For those of you who have read it already, you know that this book is not about the Mayflower. It is a history of the first two generations of Plymouth, Massachusetts. Part one, it's divided into 4 parts. Part one focuses exclusively on the Pilgrims, their exile in Holland, and how they came to migrate to the frontier of the English Empire. In my opinion, this is the strongest, most enjoyable section of the whole book. Philbrick does an excellent job of humanizing William Bradford. And if you know anything about Pilgrim mythology, you know that Bradford is the Zeus of Mount Olympus Pilgrim world. Philbrick does an outstanding job of explaining the tenets of the Pilgrims' religion, something, it seems to me, that is vital to understanding their experience in the New World, but we don't usually talk about what it was that the Pilgrims actually believed, how it is that they came to be Pilgrims because of those beliefs. It is also in part one that Philbrick can use his skills as a writer of all things maritime. His description of the ocean crossing and how the colonists planted themselves at Cape Cod, not the Virginia colony, which is where they intended to go, is really quite gripping. He also talks about John Smith, my personal colonial American hero. So, who knew that he had a part to play in the Pilgrim's drama? Part one also introduces the 2 principal Native American actors in this drama, Massasoit, Emperor of the Wampanoag Indians, and Squanto, who had spent 5 years in captivity in Europe before the Pilgrims arrived. Squanto was Massasoit's principal interpreter, but he was viewed with suspicion because of the time that he spent with Europeans and because he was not a native of the Wampanoag. And his story is actually quite tragic. He was abducted and held as a captive for years, and by the time he was returned to New England, his home community had been completely wiped out and destroyed. So he spends much of his time trying to find a new homeland, and making himself useful to Massasoit as an interpreter is a way to find a new homeland. Part 2, accommodation, and part 3, community, narrate what happened after the first Thanksgiving. Between 1620 and 1629, only 300 English pilgrims settled in and around Plymouth Colony. In the 1630s, thousands of more English settlers, many of them Puritans, but many others strangers, settled north of Plymouth and eventually south of Plymouth, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1630 alone, 17 ships arrived, non-pilgrims. What Philbrick wants readers to understand about the Pilgrims after the first Thanksgiving is that they were not necessarily inclined to ally with these new English settlers. They were separatist, after all. They prized their autonomy. There's a reason why they left England. The Pilgrims had also established a working relationship with Massasoit's nation, and the conquest behavior of the new settlers threatened to disrupt that relationship that the Pilgrims had worked so hard to develop. Philbrick cites a great example of the colony established by Thomas Weston north of Plymouth. This is a colony that was settled 6 years before the Puritans would arrive in Massachusetts Bay Colony around Boston. Weston's men look a lot like John Smith's men. They were young, exclusively male. They were warriors. They were uncommitted to agriculture. They preferred living off the labor of Indians. They behaved badly, and they were not welcomed by anyone, Wampanoag or Pilgrim. In 1623, William Bradford and the Pilgrims received word that the Massachusetts Indians intended to destroy the Weston colony and subsequently the Plymouth colony. Rather than defend their English neighbors to the north because they were English, right? The assumption is they were English and we should all stick together because we're all English. The Pilgrims went to consult Massasoit. And the two communities agreed to ally with one another to protect their own respective interests. In this case, protecting their own interests meant destroying the Massachusetts Indians who threatened to invade Weston's colony and then the Pilgrims' colony. But it also meant denying aid to Weston's colony. By the end of the conflict, which is all laid out in Philbrick's book, the Weston colony had completely disbanded, and the Massachusetts Indians had been subdued brutally by Miles Standish, the Pilgrims' military leader. This war on the Massachusetts Indians, in Philbrick's account, is a major moment in the Pilgrim history. What they succeeded in doing between the war on the Massachusetts Indians and then in subsequent years the Puritans' war on the Pequot Indians was to increase Massasoit's power in the region. In 1637, Massasoit refused to ally with the Pequots or any other Indian nation to fight the English. The Pequots were destroyed, terrified by the Puritans' total war strategy, and many other Indians left the region. But the Wampanoag, under Massasoit's leadership, stayed, and Massasoit became the dominant Indian power in New England. And what happens is a kind of peace of Massasoit. In Virginia, we talk about the peace of Pocahontas. I think you can talk about this peace of Massasoit or the peace of Massasoit and Bradford that's going to last for nearly 50 years between 1637 and the beginning of King Philip's War. It was good for Massasoit, this peace, this alliance. It was good for the Pilgrims, but also it was a bit of a risky strategy for the Indians. First, it set Massasoit apart from the other Indian communities. What the neighboring Indians learned from this experience was that the Wampanoag were not to be trusted. If it served their interests, they would throw other Indians to the side and ally with Englishmen. The peace also created conditions for the Plymouth colony to flourish. Peace brought trade and wealth and more settlers, and the settlers were the problem, were they not, for the Indians? The peace had negative consequences for the Wampanoag, who now traded heavily with the English for liquor, guns, ammunition, cloth, and manufactured goods. Between 1637 and 1675, the beginning of King Philip's War, you have functionally a generation of Wampanoag Indians who have grown up with these creature comforts, and they can't ever imagine going back to a life without these manufactured creature comforts. More important, the biggest problem with the peace is that it was only possible as long as Bradford, Standish, and Massasoit were in charge. Because more than a kind of peace agreement with treaties and such, it was a gentleman's agreement that the two nations, the Pilgrim colony and the Wampanoag, would not engage in conflict with one another or do anything to harm one another's development. Standish dies in 1656. Bradford in 1657, and Massasoit by 1662. Wow, 1772, no, 1662. And thereafter, things slowly fall apart. And here is the fourth part of Philbrick's book, War. This part of the book details the origins and course of King Philip's War between 1675 and 1676 on the English settlements. King Philip, or Metacom, was Massasoit's son and heir. Now, Massasoit, had filled this power vacuum that had developed. He was the most powerful Indian in the region. But by 1675, to be the most powerful sachem in the region really didn't mean very much anymore. Philip had inherited a nation in decline. By the 1670s, New England had approximately 80,000 English residents, from 300 to 80,000 in 50 years. And these folks had spread across and formed 110 towns. 64 of those towns were located in the Massachusetts, between Plymouth and Boston Harbor. Indians were, again, squeezed, right, by the English settlement, and even worse, by English livestock. It's not really the people so much that's the problem, it's the livestock, because the English bring their cows and their pigs, and they don't pen these things up. And they wander into Indian communities and root through the gardens, and they're a mess. And this situation was aggravated by the simultaneous decline of the Wampanoag and many of the surrounding tribes. These Indians had traded beaver pelts and wampum with the English, but the beaver was nearly extinct by 1675. And wampum, the value of it, had declined significantly. So all those creature comforts that the Indians had grown accustomed to, now cost significantly more, right? A small number of Indians had adopted Christianity and gone to live alongside the English in these segregated praying towns that were sat adjacent to the English settlements. And this, too, was seen as a threat to the Indians, to see their own community members leaving their communities to go live alongside the English. Now, unlike his father, who could control Bradford and Standish and the first generation of Pilgrims by threatening to withhold food, by threatening to use violence against their communities, King Philip really had no leverage over the next generation of English in America. Frankly, they didn't need him, right? They were a growing community. Many of these English who now lived in Massachusetts were native-born. They were adapted, acculturated. They were willing to fight and die for their new homeland in a way that, say, Thomas Weston, the John Smith lookalike, would not. When things got rough for Thomas Weston, he moved on to the next colony. These folks aren't going anywhere. They were born here. This is their home. Philbrick narrates the course of this war from the perspective of two principal protagonists. One is Benjamin Church, who led pro-English Indians into battle against Philip, and then later wrote a book about his experiences in the war. He also relies on the account of Mary Rowlandson, who was a Puritan woman who was captured by the Indians during the war and held captive for 11 weeks. She also wrote a memoir about her experience. That would be a good one to put back there if we have it. It's called The Sovereignty and Goodness of God, and it was an instant bestseller and reprinted throughout the 18th century. It is actually available online or in publications in the present. Church's account is less well known than Rowlandson's account, but Philbrick relies heavily on it for understanding the course of the war. In fact, Church is Philbrick's hero. He is characterized by his genuine interest in these Indian communities. Philbrick lives not in a settled Plymouth or a settled Boston territory. He lives out on the frontier, and most of his neighbors are Indians. And he has developed very good relations with two female sachems, heads of Indian nations. He is opposed to the English plan to place neutral Indians in an internment site on Deer Island. During the war, the English developed these internment camps and ship out neutral Indians. He opposes that. He also initially opposes English plans to sell Indian prisoners of war into slavery. But as the war drags on, however, Church also becomes a bit of a pragmatist. He changed his mind about the enslavement of Indians, concluding that if enslavement would end the war faster, then it was a legitimate weapon of war. King Philip's War was a total war, and the whole fourth part of the book is devoted to explaining this war and the course and the battles and how people are killed. The fighting moved from the battlefront to the home front, and both sides committed atrocities against civilians. It was, by all accounts, one of the deadliest conflicts in American military history. Plymouth settlement alone lost about 8% of its men. And you can compare that, for example, with the national casualty rate during the Civil War, in which case between 4 and 5% of the male fighting age population was killed. And during World War II, in which the United States lost 1% of its adult male population. More than half of the 110 English settlements were completely destroyed. So settling in New England after King Philip's War was essentially starting all over again. You weren't coming to settled communities anymore. You were coming to a war-torn area. The war, perhaps more profoundly, sliced the New England Indian population in half. Of the 20,000 Indians who lived in New England before the war, at least 2,000 were killed in battle or died of injuries. 3,000 died of sickness and starvation. 1,000 were sold as slaves in the Caribbean, and another 2,000 just fled the region altogether to the north. That is not a story that is well known, but considering the depth and breadth of the destruction, it seems to me that Philbrick is right in proclaiming that it is a story that we need to know more about. I don't have too many criticisms of this book, but I do have one, so I'll share it with you. This is a book that is very character-driven, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, history books are more interesting when they have characters. So William Bradford, Miles Standish, Massasoit, Squanto, Mary Rowlandson, King Philip, and of course, Benjamin Church, right? And Philbrick spends a lot of time trying to explain, frankly, the psychology of these people, what motivated them to do this and what motivated them to do that. I think all historians, professional historians, their biggest concern with Philbrick's account in this text is his reliance on Benjamin Church's narrative. Benjamin Church wrote entertaining passages relating to King Philip's War with some account of the divine providence towards Benjamin Church, more than 40 years after the actual war. It was also an account told by Benjamin through his son, Thomas, who was just a toddler at the time of the war. So in effect, the son asked his father to tell him what happened during the war, and 40 years after the fact, Benjamin Church wrote it all down and published it in 1716. It's 40 years removed from the war. Obviously, this young man is very proud of his father's service, and he paints Church as the hero of every battle he fought, as the voice of reason and restraint, as a man of conscience in the midst of a really bloody war of extermination. At one point in entertaining passages, and this is my students' favorite part, Benjamin Church is actually born again. He's dodging sniper fire, and he realizes that God has chosen him to be one of the saved, because that would do it, I think. And this reliance on Church, so Philbrick's reliance on Church is problematic for a lot of reasons. Now, I'm not saying that Church's account is wrong. I'm not saying Church's account is wrong. I'm saying it's problematic, right? You, I think, would be naturally inclined to be suspicious of any history any memoir written 40 years after the date of the actual events, and not by the person who experienced those events, but by a third party who's trying to speak in the voice of that person who experienced events. Yes? So this is, I think, most historians who read this book have a little bit of anxiety about this. It also seems a little bit unnecessary for Philbrick to rely so much on this account by Church, as this is one of the most well-documented wars of the colonial period. We have more than 400 letters written by eyewitnesses to the conflict in 1675 and 1676. They're not published, but they're in archives. We do also have 20 published accounts of the war, people who experienced the war in 75 and 76 and then published immediately thereafter their experiences. So there's plenty of stuff out there. So it seems a little odd that Philbrick spent so much time talking about Church. The only other thing I want to say about this book is that I assigned it to my 15 undergraduate students in my Colonial America class. 15 students, 13 of them are male, 2 of them are officer candidates, and they loved it. One student called it, I had them all write reviews for me. One student called it story-esque. It's easy to read, and it gets the point across that can be understood by average Americans. You don't need a PhD to read this book. It is filled with action and drama, these are their words. They loved this character-driven narrative. They love the maps. They love the pictures. It all helped to make sense and allow you to relate back to the text and the people's experience. They loved reading a new story about colonial America, not one that they had heard in 4th grade history or 11th grade history or what have you. And only one of them, and this is remarkable, complained that it was too long. But when I told them about church, and I asked them to do the math, they all felt a little bit duped. They already think we're all lying to them about everything. So I guess I wanted to tell you about church so that you don't have the same experience, yes? Okay. I have brought Joe has been kind enough to pull out 2 other books by other authors that might be of interest to you if you really enjoyed this book. One is Jill Lepore's The Name of War. It's back there. Jill Lepore she's a historian at Harvard University. She's actually a veteran. She served in the United States Army and then went to graduate school. And she wrote her first book on King Philip's War. And she is probably the historian that is most critical about this text and what it does. And it's what she feels is kind of a deceptive quality, because Philbrick doesn't tell you about the problems with church's narrative. You kind of have to do the math yourself and figure it out. She is an outstanding historian, and she writes beautifully. She's one of these historians who writes academic histories, but she also writes for The Atlantic. So she goes back and forth between an academic audience and a lay audience, really with great ease. The other book I asked Joe to pull was Karen Kupperman's The Jamestown Project. Karen Kupperman is a scholar of Jamestown and Roanoke, and she produced this book, The Jamestown Project, that kind of puts all of these settlements in the larger context of what's happening in England in the 16th century, in the 16th and 17th century. So what's going on in the rest of the world that would influence or shape the experience of the settlers? And my students thought it was a great read. They thought it was, again, a history book that told them things that they didn't know before about these people who came to America. So that's all I was going to say. I was going to open up the conversation. I'm sorry? Now, please, come on. You all have read this book. You can disagree with me. Oh, the director. Oh, no.
A real honest question. I read about the praying Indians.
The praying Indians, yeah.
And I just wonder, do we know anything about them? Where did they get this name? Is the name something like Thanksgiving, where it came later? And how did they feel about these people?
How does Sue feel about those people?
The saints.
Well, I'm going to refer you to Lepore's book, because she actually has a very long discussion about the praying Indians. And as you can imagine, the Puritans, most of them live outside the Puritan colony and Massachusetts Bay. There is a sort of, the Puritans are sort of have mixed feelings about the praying Indians. On the one hand, they feel like this is what they should be doing, right? They should be bringing the word of God to the Indians. It's a good thing when you save souls for Jesus. On the other hand, they're Indians, and they're a different race, and there's anxiety about that race of people and what they're capable of. So when the question of should we intern these Indians comes up, most English people say yes, notwithstanding the fact that they're Christian Indians, notwithstanding the fact that they're neighbors and functionally anglicized. Most Puritans agree that the praying Indians should be interned at Deer Island. Only a handful of people protest that. But again, I would send you to Jill Lepore, because she has a great discussion about this. Dr. John Enriquez, another historian and colleague. Go ahead.
You correctly, I think, talked at the beginning about wanting to distance the mythological view of the Pilgrims. You know, they come to this country for religious liberty. Well, not really. But that's a 19th century concept. Given that that's a myth, and we want to unpack it, how having read Philbrick, how should we look at Plymouth Colony? How would Philbrick say that we look at Plymouth Colony? I mean, what you pointed out about the emergence of the English immigrants, they come over. It makes sense to me that the Indians that some Indians would not worry about allying themselves with them because these people are pathetic. They can't raise a crop. Mm-hmm. And yet you turn around and then 50 years later there's 80,000 of them. Should we read this as a cautionary tale against illegal immigration? Or does it have some other kind of, what kind of meaning should we take away from the Plymouth story?
I think what I would say to that, well, you've read it as well. I mean, it seems to me that what Philbrick really wants to emphasize is the separatist quality here. That Philbrick continually emphasizes that Pilgrims were not Puritans. Like they are, but they're not, right? And the Puritans were the evangelical breed, right? They were the ones who wanted to convert. They wanted to create a city upon a hill. And the Pilgrims really wanted to be separate and apart and create a distinctive culture and community for Pilgrims them alone, right? So they're equally hostile, to strangers and heathens and Puritans. They're not naturally inclined to go work with the Puritans. Allying with the Puritans seems to be a necessary evil for the Pilgrims. I'm not answering your question. Think of...
If we're not going to see this as, people striking a blow for religious liberty.
They're not striking a blow for religious liberty. Yes, and in fact, one of the things that Philbrick argues is that the more strangers that show up, whether they're Puritans or Thomas Westons, what's that?
They were intolerable.
The less tolerant they became, right? I mean, for the Pilgrims, it was never a question of tolerance or intolerance. It was, this is how we want to live. We can't do it in England. We can't do it in Holland. Let's go try to do it on the frontier. They think they've got a great arrangement sitting there, right? Massasoit's going to stay away from them. They're going to have their little space or little ground where they can raise their children the way they want. And then these Puritans show up, and Thomas Weston shows up, and all of a sudden now they have to develop, these codes of behavior that need to be codified. So anybody who shows up toes the line. But that was not part of their original agenda, right? It was only in response to the arrival of the Puritans, in response to the arrival of people like Weston, that they had to codify their values in a way that presently looks really intolerant, right? But they never would have claimed that they wanted religious freedom for anybody other than themselves. Yeah.
Their military tactics, was that standard European practices, what they did in this new world?
The total war component of waging war on the Sylvan.
Putting them on posts and wiping people out and striking first. It would just seem very brutal to me, but I think they wanted to strike fear, but I was wondering if that was normal European war practices.
Well, going after civilians is a normal practice in European warfare, even in the 16th century, right? Raping women and brutalizing children. That's a part of warfare even in the 16th century in Europe. The thing about putting heads on pikes and what have you, some of these practices, if you read Kupperman, you'll find out that some of these practices are actually learned in Ireland. The wars on Ireland in the 16th century, and actually in the 16th century, the Elizabethan plantation system, the wars on the Catholics in Ireland are equally as brutal. The idea of sort of rounding your enemy up in a fort and then burning them alive, and anybody trying to escape, you shoot them on the way out. That was something that was well developed in Ireland in the 1500s, 1580s. So they were, again, they were bringing these components to the war. And of course, they're tactics that are designed to win the war. They're also tactics that are designed to, scare the hell out of you. So you'll think twice before picking up a musket and going to war with the Pilgrims, that you would prefer, fleeing to the frontier in the north or the frontier in the west, rather than take your chances with them. Yes, ma'am.
All the stuff is from Bradford's writings.
A
lot of the stuff in the book, right? You said
Bradford is one of the central characters, and yes, he uses the Plymouth Plantation.
Right. What I was wondering is that did Bradford write all along, or did he at some point in his life say, "Oh, I'm going to write down all of what happened"? Is his from memory a lot, or as it was going, was he keeping a log?
Those texts were also edited. I don't know, John. Do you know if those were kept along the way, or Bradford's texts?
No, he's not. He's not writing from. He's sort of doing a church thing.
He's doing a church thing, but his accounts are verifiable, right? There are plenty of other accounts, contemporary accounts, men and women, or men contemporary to Bradford who are also writing. So you can kind of verify what Bradford's doing. More of it, more verifiable. Church is 40 years removed. Most of the characters are dead. Nobody can refute that. In my class, I think this hit my students particularly hard because they had just read about John Smith's account of Pocahontas, which I think, as you know, John Smith wrote 2 accounts of his time in the New World. And the first one, he doesn't mention Pocahontas at all. She doesn't exist. And a lot of the other accounts written contemporarily do not mention Pocahontas at all. She doesn't really exist as a character. His second account is published after she is dead. And this is the one that tells the story of his, capture, release at the hands of Pocahontas. And, the students were very suspicious of any account, written about somebody who is now dead and cannot refute it or offer an alternative view. So I think this is why the church account hit them as pretty hard. Church could be telling the truth. I'm not saying church is lying. I'm not saying church is lying. We weren't there. We don't know. But, we just read it, conscious that that memories fail, memories glorify. Okay.
In having read the book.
You've already read it.
Right. That's what I was always wondering about. How do we really know this? And is it written? Yeah, it's written down. It's written down. It's written down. But when did it get written down? Right away?
Yeah.
In a week.
In a week or So, but there's plenty of other stuff that was published. I mean, again, Mary Rowlandson's account is very well read and very published. It's still taught in a lot of classrooms, and that's an engaging narrative as well. And you can also, if you look at the Lepore book, you can look through her bibliography and you can find a lot of the published accounts of the war. You might find those enjoyable. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
About Roger Williams, did he write at the time?
Roger Williams did keep records at the time. Yes, he did keep records at the time, and he actually kept an account of this war as well. Roger Williams is a community that desperately wants to stay out of the war. And the Indians actually, King Philip's, the warriors who are fighting in King Philip's War, approach him at one point, and he begs them not to be engaged in this conflict. He sees what's coming. So he keeps his people out, but he has no luck in trying to convince his Indian friends to stay out of it as well. I'm sorry, Max.
The 2 sects, the Puritans and the Pilgrims. According to the last part of the book, the epilogue, 10% of the United States population probably could go all the way back to Mayflower. However, the sects, I don't remember what has happened to them. Are they still around, or?
Puritans are now Congregationalists. I understand that. Puritanism sort of rises and falls through the 18th century, and then there's this great revival in the middle of the 18th century. And at the core of Puritanism is this notion of being born again, that you will have a moment when God will reveal that you are saved, and that you can testify to your community that you've had this revelation has come to you, and then your community verifies it. So in a lot of ways, lots of religious communities now have this tradition of giving testimony of salvation. But Puritanism sort of morphed in the 18th century into contemporary Congregationalist communities.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. You're saying Pilgrims, but Pilgrims and Puritans morphed, right, together at some point?
They morphed together. Well, the territory after, one of the things that happens...
There are similarities between them.
Yeah, there are similarities between them. And Pilgrims are functionally overrun by Puritans, right? The community, the population of people who want to really separate and live separate and apart in a utopian community is really quite small. right? And they're eventually overrun by Puritans who, don't want to live separate and apart. If anything, they want to create the city on a hill model, right? Come and look at me and the exemplary work that we're doing here, and you too could have this. And there's just more of those people. I was going to say, I forgot what I was going to say. They are overrun. And one of the consequences of the war, by the way, is that Massachusetts is a territory that is not, before 1675, you have the Plymouth Colony, you have the Massachusetts Bay Colony, right? You have all these sort of independent, autonomous colonies spread out across the eastern seaboard. After this war is so devastating to population and to economy that the English government functionally takes it over and makes it one big Massachusetts colony and just lumps all these people together and gives them, an English system of government.
That kind of leads into or attaches to what I'm going to say. I find it interesting. We're talking Massachusetts Bay, or we're talking Plymouth on the ocean, on the Atlantic Ocean, in 1620. Is that correct?
The Pilgrims come first. The Puritans don't come until the 1630s.
Okay.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as a local or born and raised Albanian, we had right here, was it at Fort Orange, and then naturally down the river, New York City as well. And then you just mentioned how after King Philip's War, Great Britain decided, well, we want it all for ourselves, more or less, and that was the progression, I guess. They took it, and then in 1776, the colonists decided that they wanted it, or we wanted it for ourselves, and there we go into the Revolutionary War. So, but that's American history.
Well, fair enough. I want to say, as somebody who lives and breathes in the colonial era, God save the Queen. In defense of the English Empire, they did sort of shut down these sort of independent Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay colonies. They did it, with a sense that this is going to be good for the health of the empire, right? Rather than to have 20 million little itty-bitty colonies, to have one big Massachusetts colony. The English government didn't say, well, now you all must be Puritans, or now you all must be Pilgrims, or now you Dutch must be English. All they really wanted was to everybody to conform to sort of common law practices. The English Empire was very tolerant of diversity within the empire. It was a huge empire. They were welcome to have, Puritans, Pilgrims, Germans, French. I mean, by the time of the American Revolution, most of the people who live in America are not of England. They're German, they're Scots-Irish, they're French, they're Protestants, they're Jews, there's Catholics. It's a huge mess of people. And England, for the most part, one of the extraordinary strengths of the First English Empire is all this diversity, and they can cope with this diversity. And functionally, the agreement is we just all have to abide by English common law. We have to have representative systems of government, with a check, and that check being the royally appointed governor. But otherwise, if we're all making money, England doesn't really care who lives in its colonies, Pilgrims, Puritans, whatever. Oh, Mr. Nash.
Just a thought, maybe the Saugus Iron Works in Massachusetts is fascinating. It was started, I think, about 1640, and the Puritans brought over these iron workers from Great Britain, and it was interesting because the Puritans couldn't work on Sundays. That's their religion. But ironworks, the bog ironworks there had to go 7 days a week, so most of their ironworkers were imported. And that's a fascinating national park. It's the Saugus Ironworks. It's
the Saugus Ironworks.
Yeah, it's near Boston, a little east of, west of Boston. Close, of course, in 1640s. And that's a fascinating national park on this same period and the problems that the Puritans had trying to establish these bog ironworks, but they themselves, they find some of these English and Scottish workers for wearing lace or drinking too much. So there was a big conflict between the Puritans and the people they brought over. It's a fascinating park to go to because they rebuilt the ironworks. I mean, they don't set it on fire, but in the same place with the dams and the huge wheels and the gigantic bellows, and it's a fascinating place to go.
Yeah, most of the settlements in 17th century British North America, English North America, have something kind of similar. I mean, you know, because the idea was that for the English Empire was to develop these colonies so that these colonies could produce things within the English Empire, so the English didn't have to go to the Ottoman Empire to get them, for example, right? So keep it all in the family. So in Jamestown, there's, you know, I think there's a glass works. You know, can you imagine these people are starving and struggling for food and fighting for every scratch of ground, but also trying to build a glass works, right? I mean, it's very ambitious. This is a very ambitious generation of men and women. Yeah. Oh, yes, ma'am.
I've been interested in the Indians. We did dreadful things to them all through our history. I'm curious as to why we haven't heard about life on reservations throughout our country today. Can you recommend any book that would bring us up to date?
Well, I'm going to send you back to Jill Lepore's book, In the Name of War, in part because the last section of her book deals with the Indians after King Philip's War and how they cope and how they, you know, regain their footing and try to maintain their culture in a place where they're being, you know, where their culture is slowly being taken over by an English culture. I don't think that, as somebody who does colonial and revolutionary America, I would not say that what you have in colonial America is a reservation system in the way that we have a reservation system presently. I lived in Arizona for 4 years, so I'm familiar with reservations and how they function. And the reservation system, I think even in New York, is a 20th century phenomenon. Is that right? Or 19th century phenomenon. What you have in the 17th and 18th century is an agreement not to live together, right? There's a recognition that those are independent nations, that those are nations that can be a threat to English in America in the same way the French are a threat to English in America. But the American government does not have any sway over Indian nations in the 17th and 18th century the way it does now. I mean, American government is, really interferes with reservations in a lot of ways. That is not the case in the 17th and 18th century. They are seen as legitimate nations, a threat to this country, a force to be reckoned with. They're not to be pitied. Americans in the 17th and 18th century do not pity Indians. They are genuinely fearful of them, and they see them as independent nations acting independently, developing strength. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I find that driving the trip to Boston is a little bit tedious. And so I just keep wondering, how did the Indians, how did even the English find, like, Scotticoke, where Prince Philip, how do they know that there's colonies there, or even...
presently? How do we know there are colonies?
No, I mean, how do you go without any shoes on your feet, marching or walking to, miles and miles away? And how do they know where they want to, how to get to where they want to go to?
Does anybody else want to take that? Well, Philbrick tells you that, by the way, these are the Indians who developed the moccasin. So they were not barefoot. I honestly, I don't have an answer for that. That is the work of an anthropologist. And I'm sure if Joe gave me a day or two, I could find some good anthropological studies of the Indians, the Algonquin Indians, and he could put them on reserve for you. But I don't know. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry.
Was John Howland portrayed at all in the book? I haven't read it.
John Howland. Howland.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You want to tell him?
No, but he's portrayed in the book. It's an interesting story. I don't want to ruin it for him.
Okay.
No, it's interesting. I thought it was interesting.
Okay.
Why is John Smith your colonial hero?
Oh, I love John Smith. I mean, he... Well, there is this generation of men who are kind of in the right time, in the right place. They are a people without a nation, and John Smith is one of them. They are genuine explorers. They want to go see the world. They want to map. They want to be engaged in relations with foreign people, right? I mean, John Smith, he lives amongst the Ottomans for a while. And then he lives amongst the Indians for a while. I think they're kind of genuinely interested in other people and opportunity. And they, like I said, they're nationless. They just hop from country to country to country. Whoever's willing to pay their bills to travel and explore and to map. And he has some really interesting insights. I mean, one of the things that he says to England after so many years of living in America is that Virginia's a bit of a waste. You should focus on the Northeast because they got fish. And fish is the future. And in a way, he was absolutely right. I mean, if you're from the Northeast, you know that the fishing industry was huge and instrumental in building the English Empire. The Northeast fished, and that fish fed slaves in the Caribbean, and it fed all kinds of other laboring people. So he just has some incredible insights. He's also, he is dashing and daring and all of that. And he tells a good story, whether it's true or not. I mean, back to that problem. He tells a good story.
Okay, well, one more. Using your John Smith, I mean, they all weren't like John Smith.
They all weren't like John Smith.
Right. Many of them were a little bit naive coming to this country because they were not prepared for the things that happened, particularly at Jamestown.
I think that's true for most people who were working for John Smith. And John Smith would certainly say that he was the only one in his crew who knew what he was doing. I love that. Go ahead.
But I was going to comment is to, they sold a bill of goods when they came here, because forget about the religious kind of separation. Mm-hmm. They could not be prepared for the kinds of things,
the hardships
that they went under.
Well, I mean, certainly in the case of John Smith's, most of the folks who traveled with John Smith were men. They had some sort of martial experience. They had either served in Ireland or they had served in the fighting against the Ottoman Empire. So these were young soldiers or veterans, a lot of them. I think they felt like they could handle it. That, whatever the new world had to throw them, it was not going to be that much different than, fighting the savages in Ireland, right? So I think they thought that they were up to it. And then, of course, in the 17th century, you have a culture that believes that some people are born to lead, quite literally. Like, if you are born an aristocrat, then therefore you should be a leader because God put you on earth to lead. That's why you're an aristocrat. And those folks, I think, it never occurred to them to doubt that they couldn't handle it, that they could handle it, right? I mean, they were born to lead. They were aristocrats in England. Why wouldn't they be aristocrats in Virginia? The Pilgrims, of course, in Massachusetts in general, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, those are men, women, and children who came. And those folks really took a leap of faith. They were not people who were aristocrats. They did not necessarily have a martial background. They really were working on faith alone.
Thanks for coming, Jeff.